Hello again. This is Lawrence Holgate, the author of Understanding John Stuart Mill, and specifically Understanding John Stuart Mill's classic book, Utilitarianism. If you have my book, you can follow along as I read and make comments, and if you don't have the book, well, get it now at Amazon.com, so you can read along. Just go to my website, holgatebooks.com. Spell my name correctly, Houlgate. Remember the U. So let's get on with episode 4 and look at where we left off. Where we left off was Mill's very deft response to the criticism that the principle of utility was suitable only for pigs. In fact, the critic said any principle that tried to say that the greatest good was pleasure, as Mill does, is actually defaming human beings, as if we're somehow at the level of pigs. Well, Mill answered that by saying the pleasures of a pig are nothing like the pleasures of a human being. They have something in common with human beings. For example, we both get hungry and we benefit by the food we eat when we're hungry. That would be one. I won't go over any others. Let's just call that an animal appetite. We both have animal appetites for food, for example, and for water. But that isn't all that we have as human beings. We also have pleasures of the mind, mental pleasures. And once you put in mental pleasures, the pleasures we get from reading a book, the pleasures we get from going to the symphony or to a concert, those are not pleasures that the pig could enjoy. They are not at the level, the intellectual level, we should say, of human beings. So the pleasures of humans are quite different than the pleasures of pigs, and the criticism just collapses on that point. So what can we do? Mill goes further now, and this is where he gets criticized. He says that pleasures of the mind, mental pleasures, are qualitatively better than physical pleasures. He doesn't talk about the quantitative measurement of pleasure, where we'd ask, well, how long does a pleasure last, for example? How intensive is a pleasure? Those would be quantitative. We could do a quantitative search or for those kind of pleasures. No, he goes to a qualitative difference between mental and physical pleasures, and that's where he gets into some trouble, because of how he decides that one pleasure is qualitatively better than another. He says that we are justified in ascribing to the preferred enjoyment a superiority in quality so far outweighing quantity as to render it in comparison of small account. So now he's saying something more. Quantitative measurements are of small account, that the superiority is so great for mental pleasures that quantitative pleasures could never keep up. Now, how does he apply this standard? We talked about this, but let's talk about it again. Mill says that it is an unquestionable fact that those who are equally acquainted with and equally capable of appreciating and enjoying both do give a most marked preference to the manner of existence which employed their higher faculties. All right, let me stop there. If we are equally acquainted with and equally capable of appreciating and enjoying both physical pleasures and mental pleasures, then the person who gets to vote as to which is the better surely could only be those who have the capability of mental pleasures. Few human creatures, he says, would consent to be changed into any of the lower animals for a promise of the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures. And no intelligent person would consent to be a fool. No instructed person would be an ignoramus if they were offered the chance to be an ignoramus. Would you? If you were an educated person, would you, in order to get the fullest allowance of an ignoramus's pleasure, Would you choose that path? If an intelligent person enjoyed the pleasures of intelligence, would that person consent to be a fool? If you were an intelligent person, and I assume you are, you're listening to this broadcast, would you consent to be a fool? If someone said, well, look, if you're a fool, then you can enjoy all these physical pleasures. You won't have to worry about the mental ones. No, we wouldn't. I think Mill is right on this. It's an empirical claim, of course. We'd have to take a poll, but I think very few of us would consent to be a fool for the rest of our lives. Notice, though, the subtle switch that Mill makes from comparing two different types of pleasure, the mental and physical. He compares them to two manners of existence. He tries to persuade us that once we are acquainted with the life of the intelligent person and the life of the fool, most of us would choose the former. We would choose the life of the intelligent person, not the life of the fool. But that's not what Mill initially promised to prove. He had promised to give empirical evidence for the former claim about specific mental and bodily pleasures. In other words, every mental pleasure you can think of must be better than every bodily pleasure that you can think of. Better, okay? He was going to tell us how that came up, but he doesn't do that. Instead, he says, look, let's look at a whole life of someone who is intelligent and the whole life of someone who is a fool, and compare the two. What life do you want? There's probably good reason he makes this feint from the F-E-I-N-T, the feint from the comparison of kinds of pleasures to the comparison of kinds of lives. Mill must have been aware that there are many counterexamples of persons competently acquainted with a large variety of mental and bodily pleasures. But who often would choose the latter, would often choose bodily pleasures. Let's take an example of the newlyweds, Percival and Griselda. I love those names. I made them up. For example, so let's take those newlyweds, and let's suppose they are competently acquainted with the bodily pleasures of sexual intercourse and the mental pleasures of thinking about philosophical problems. They both have recently graduated with a BA in philosophy. Okay, you get the picture now? When asked, let's suppose Percival and Griselda, when asked, where would they place their mutual pleasures of sexual intercourse? So would they place their mutual pleasures of sexual intercourse so far above the pleasure of thinking about philosophical problems that they would prefer the former? That is, the pleasures of sexual intercourse. Moreover, at the early stage of their marriage, quote, they would not resign it for any quantity of the mental pleasure which their nature is capable of. Now, it might be objected to this example that this is only one instance of persons choosing a bodily pleasure over a mental pleasure. Percival and Griselda, who are having their first act of sexual intercourse on their wedding night. Okay, so all right, we ask them the next day, what do you prefer, the bodily pleasure or the mental of sex, or the mental pleasure of thinking about philosophical problems? Well, I do believe that they would choose the former, the bodily pleasure. The choice of examples depends upon what competent acquaintance and experience means and the social circumstances of the persons who are evaluating their experiences. It's the degree of competence and acquaintance of John Stuart Mill and his highly educated friends in mid-19th century England that it is doubtful that they would give a decided preference to a bodily pleasure as the more desirable pleasure. But suppose we choose a group of 21st century American college students who have experienced both kinds of pleasure, and if asked whether they would prefer to party on Saturday night or stay at home and discuss the work of Hegel, I would wager a sizable bet that most of them would prefer the former. Let's party. If asked, they would insist that going to a party on a Saturday night is a more desirable pleasure. And I think we can all agree that Mill is on firmer ground when he discusses and compares the manner of existence of a human being to that of a fool and a pig. A lifetime existence now. He says this, It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of different opinion, it's because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. So the human being knows both sides. They know the mental and the physical. The pig only knows the physical. I don't know how they got this information from a fool or a pig, but hypothetically, I would conjecture that if a human being is Sorry, I dropped my book. Embarrassing. And no, I didn't get any pleasure out of it. I was saying that I would conjecture that if a human being is feeling quite miserable after the loss of a loved one, and he or she is offered the opportunity to have a lobotomy, thereby reducing their mental capacity to that of a fool or a pig, they wouldn't take the offer, even if assured that their bodily needs would be satisfied for the rest of their pig-like life. And I think you would agree with me. I think you would agree with these people who are offered this. Now, I don't know how to get this information from a fool or a pig, but I would hypothetically conjecture that if a human being is feeling quite miserable after the loss of a loved one, and he or she is offered the opportunity to have a lobotomy, wouldn't you do the same? You would thereby reduce your mental capacity to a fool or a pig? You still wouldn't take the offer. Okay, let's go to the next section. In my book, it's 2.2.2. That's Chapter 2, Section 2.2. And at page 36, if you're not reading the book, just go by the section heads. It's called The Utilitarian Theory of Life is Irrational. And this is the second objection. The second objection to the utilitarian theory of life is that happiness cannot be the rational purpose of human life because, A, happiness is not attainable, the critic says, and B, even if it is attainable, humans should renounce happiness as a necessary condition of achieving virtue, which is higher than happiness. So that's the second criticism of the utilitarian philosophy. So let's look at the first. How does Mill reply to the objection that happiness is not attainable? His reply is that the objection rests on a confusion of two meanings of the word happiness. If by this word the objector means a continuity of highly pleasurable excitement, then it's evident enough that this is just impossible. Someone might be able to make a state of exalted pleasure last for moments or even hours or days, but it is psychologically impossible to make this kind of pleasure a permanent, long-lasting experience. There is another meaning of the word happiness, though. It's what an elderly person might mean when she reflects on her past and she says, "I have had a happy life." She would probably not mean a life of rapture. Now get this. This is what Mill says at page 13 of Utilitarianism. Not my book, but of the book Utilitarianism. He says, happiness is not a life of rapture, but moments of such in an existence made up of few and transitory pains, many and various pleasures, with a decided predominance of the active over the passive, and having as the foundation of the whole not to expect more from life than it is capable of bestowing. And Mill says that there are many persons who have achieved this kind of life, and it is worthy of the name of happiness. That's a happy life. I'll let you think about this. If you get to the point where you might look at your life, look at what has happened to you, would you say that there have been a few and transitory pains balanced off, way off, by many and various pleasures? Have the pleasures that you made for yourself dominated over the passive pleasures, the pleasures that just happened to you? And having as the foundation not to expect more from life than life is capable of bestowing. Mill says for the people he knows, that he knew in the 19th century, many of them were not happy, leading happy lives, because, he says, we in England have a wretched education and wretched social arrangements, and that explains why happiness is not attainable by all persons. All right, let's move now to the second part of this objection, the obligation to renounce happiness. Mill actually says that the critic says that we have an obligation to renounce happiness. They say it's certainly possible to do without happiness in one's life. Mill writes that this is done involuntarily by 19/20ths of mankind, even in those parts of our present world which are at least deep in barbarism. But it is also done voluntarily by the hero or the martyr for the sake of something which he prizes more than his individual happiness. The hero who throws himself over the bullet or over the bomb for the sake of saving the lives of the other soldiers. The relevant question is whether there is an obligation to renounce one's own happiness. The hero or the martyr does not sacrifice himself just for the sake of self-sacrifice. He does it for the sake of something which he prizes more than his individual happiness. For example, the happiness of a loved one or for the good of his country. The sacrifice is a means to an end. It's not its own end. They don't just do it for itself. They do it because they want to make somebody else happy. This is not to deny that there are some people who renounce their own happiness just for the sake of renouncing it. The ascetic, mounted on his pillar, may be an inspiring proof of what men can do, but assuredly it is not an example of what they should do. If it is argued that self-sacrifice is a means of attaining not happiness but virtue, which is better than happiness, here's what Mill responds. He says, would that sacrifice be made if the hero or the martyr did not believe that it would earn for others immunity from similar sacrifices? Would it be made if he thought that his renunciation of happiness for himself would produce no fruit for any of his fellow creatures? The ascetic's sacrifice, that's at page 16, by the way, of Mill's Utilitarianism. The ascetic's sacrifice is wasted if it doesn't increase the sum total of happiness. I'll repeat that. Your sacrifice is wasted if it doesn't increase the sum total of happiness. In other words, we have to balance your sacrifice against what you're getting for it. The only self-renunciation which the utilitarian applauds is devotion to the happiness or to some of the means of happiness of others, either of mankind collectively or of individuals within the limits imposed by the collective interests of mankind. Mill concludes his reply to the objection by reminding the reader that the utilitarian standard of what is right in conduct is not the agent's own happiness, but the happiness of all persons concerned. When making a calculation about the amount of pleasure and pain that might be caused by doing one action rather than another, that person impartially considers the pleasure and pain of all persons affected, not just his own pleasure and pain. In this way, the utilitarian morality accepts and matches the ideal perfection of the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule says to do as you would be done by, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So Mill says that the principle of utility, it can explain sacrifice, and the principle of utility is actually identical to the Golden Rule. So I think he's pretty much put this criticism to bed. That takes us to the end of the first part of the objections. We're going to start at the next episode, coming up next Monday, episode 5. We're going to start at page 39, section for you with the digital book. It's section 2.2.3, titled The Utilitarian Standard is Too High for Humans. This is an interesting objection, by the way. It's one of Mill's response is just brilliant. So the objector says the utilitarian standard is too high for humans. This is interesting because the objector, much earlier in the chapter, said that the utilitarian is too low for humans. Remember, that was the pig objection. Now it's a standard that is too high for humans. Okay, we'll see you next week, and thank you for listening.